Hello everyone and welcome to Butterfly Meadows Homestead. I'm Dorinda. I've had several requests from people asking how to make a sourdough starter. So I just wanted to take this moment to tell you how I make mine and how I maintain mine. And first I want to start off by going over what you will need in order to make your starter. You're going to need some kind of a glass container. I like to use a mason jar, and I have two of these weck jars which I love for my starter because they are very wide. The top is very wide and they have this little glass lid that just sits on top of them, but you don't have to have a weck jar. I got these for Christmas one year. I only have two, but I use them for my sourdough. But you can use a mason jar, you can use any kind of a glass container that you can cover to put your sourdough starter in. So you're going to need some kind of container with a lid. Notice I only have the lid here and not the ring because we don't want to seal this up tightly. You're going to need 1/4 of a cup of flour. Here I have rye flour and here is just plain all-purpose flour, and I'll explain that in a moment. And so here's a 1/4 measuring cup for the flour, and in this cup I have 1/4 cup of water. So when you begin making your sourdough starter, you want to make sure that your jar and your lid and your utensils are very clean. Anytime I'm doing anything that ferments, I make sure that everything is extremely clean, because fermenting is literally growing bacteria, and I only want to grow the good bacteria, not any bad bacteria. So you have your clean jar, and what you're going to do is you're going to take your 1/4 cup of room temperature water. You don't want cold water. You can use cold water, but that's just going to slow things down. And so that's 1/4 cup of water, and you're going to need 1/4 cup of flour. I like to start my starter with rye flour, but I know that's a specialty flour that most of you don't have on hand, and if you don't want to go out and buy rye flour, you don't have to. But I like to use rye flour because the rye flour naturally has the good bacteria on it that we want to grow. This is regular all-purpose flour, and it's been bleached and all of that good stuff, so there's not a lot of the good bacteria left in this flour. So I can make a starter from this flour. It's going to be very slow and sluggish starting off. It's going to take a long time to get the starter really strong if I start off with this flour. But if that's all you have and you want to make a starter from it, you can. Whatever flour you have, you can use. Just know that different different kinds of flour has different amounts of that lactobacillus or whatever that bacteria is that we are trying to grow. So I'm going to demonstrate using the rye flour because that's how I always start off. And so you want 1/4 of a cup of flour, rye flour if at all possible. So here we have our flour and our water. That's all you need. We're going to stir this up really well. Just make sure there's no lumps of dry flour. Just get it stirred up really well. Now what you're going to do is you're going to take this container and you're going to put a loose fitting lid on it, and you're going to sit it in a warm place in your kitchen. I usually sit mine beside the automatic coffee maker. We have a bun, so it has that little heater that keeps the water hot and ready to make coffee, and so it's a warm place, and that's usually where I sit mine. Or you can sit it inside of your oven. Ovens are always warmer on the inside even without the light on, but just sit it in a warm place. And for the first I would say at least 3 days. All I do to mine is stir it. And the reason I stir it is to keep from any kind of mold or bad bacteria growing on the top. So for the first 2-3 days, maybe longer if you're using white flour, just stir it up a little bit to move that mixture around, and then put your lid back on it. Now after about 3 days, you should begin to see some bubbles. There should be at least a few little bubbles starting to form. Then you know your sourdough starter is beginning to come alive. I do not feed my sourdough starter when I'm starting a new starter until I start to see those bubbles. So after you see the bubbles, then you want to feed it. Now we're going to have to do a little math here, but it's not complicated. You notice when I first started this, I used 1/4 cup of flour, 1/4 cup of water. That is called a 1-to-1 ratio. That means I had equal amount of flour and an equal amount of water. So when I feed my starter, I want to continue the 1-to-1 ratio. But now I have 3 ingredients instead of just 2. I have my starter, my flour, and my water. So this is a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio, but all are in equal amounts. Now I know that because I had 1/4 of a cup of flour and 1/4 of a cup of water, that equals 1/2 of a cup total. So I have a 1/2 cup of starter here. So if I feed this starter, I am going to feed it with a 1/2 cup of water and a 1/2 cup of flour. So I'm going to mix the 1/2 cup of water and the 1/2 cup of flour into my 1/2 cup of starter. That's a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio, and I'm going to stir that in. And I'm going to set it back in a warm place. Then the next day, it's time to feed your starter again. Now this is when things start to get a little complicated and some people get a little uneasy, because now I have 1.5 cups of starter in this jar, because I fed a 1/2 cup with a 1/2 cup of water and a 1/2 cup of flour, and if I total all that up, that's 1.5 cups. So if I just straight feed what I have, I am going to need 1.5 cups of water and 1.5 cups of flour to add to my 1.5 cups of starter. That is 4.5 cups. If I count it right, that's 4.5 cups all together of liquid. Well, this quart jar only holds 4 cups. And when starter ferments, it bubbles and it expands. So that's not going to do. I'm going to need a very large container if I do that. But the best thing to do is get you a 1/2 cup measuring cup. Measure out a 1/2 cup of your starter. Throw the rest in the trash. Don't put it down your sink. It might eventually, over time, if you put enough of that stuff down your sink, it's going to sit up like cement and you're going to have plumbing problems. But take out a 1/2 cup of your new starter that you're feeding and getting strong and going, and feed it on the 1-to-1-to-1 ratio. So you will need a 1/2 cup of starter, a 1/2 cup of flour, and a 1/2 cup of water. Mix that all together and put it in your jar. Every time you feed your starter, you are going to do the 1-to-1-to-1 ratio. So that means that's why you have to discard. Now, once your starter is mature and you're just feeding it to maintain, you are not going to have to discard so much. But in the beginning, when you are getting your starter going, you will have to discard, because that starter is not strong enough to do anything with as far as sourdough goes. So there's really not much you can do with it. You might could add it to something you were baking or whatever, but the best thing to do is just count up the cost. It's very inexpensive when you consider what it would cost to buy a starter just to throw away your discard as you're getting your starter going. So hopefully you understand the 1-to-1-to-1 ratio. Now, some things you need to know about starter is you can overfeed a starter and it be fine. But if you underfeed that starter, it might die or get very weak. So that's why we use the 1-to-1-to-1 ratio. We know that the starter is getting enough food. The starter actually feeds on the flour and the water that you mix with it. So you wouldn't want to take a half a cup of starter. Let's say you thought, well, I'm going to save so that I don't have to discard so much. I'm just going to use what starter I have and just feed it a little bit of flour and a little bit of water. What you're going to have is a very hungry starter that's going to be weak and possibly die. And if it's not strong, then you can grow mold and all kinds of things can happen. But if you stick to that 1-to-1-to-1 ratio, you should be fine. Anytime during this process, if you start to see pink mold or any kind of fuzzy mold, you're going to have to throw it out because you don't want to grow mold. And I have found different areas of the country, different homes have different results with growing a starter. I used to live in a very humid environment and there was a lot of mold, not necessarily the kind that will kill you, but like in my bathroom shower and in different places, mold would just grow what seemed like overnight sometimes because it was moist and it was hot and it was humid and it was just right for the mold to grow. So if you're having a problem with mold, you might want to, what you could do is make sure your starter is not around anything like, let's say, around your, close to your sink or anything that might be encouraging that mold. Just maybe change the placement of where you're keeping your starter if you're having a mold problem. And if you do have a mold problem, wash everything thoroughly and start over. But it's going to take you, it's different for everyone, but it's going to take anywhere from, I want to say 2 weeks. Some people say 7 days, but I think in 7 days of starting a fresh new starter, that starter is going to be pretty weak. But it's going to take probably at least 2 weeks of you feeding and discarding and feeding your starter every day for 2 weeks. And by then, you should notice that when you feed your starter, some people will take a rubber band and put around the container at the line of where the starter is after they feed it, so they can then tell how much it rose, because a good healthy starter doubles in size. Within several hours, it should double in size. And when you and what will happen when you have this small amount of starter in your jar, what will happen is when you feed it, it will begin to bubble and it will double in size in a few hours. And if you don't do something with it, soon after that, it will continue to eat and on the flour and the water. Then it will fall, and you'll be able to see on the side of the jar where it rose and it fell. That's because it's hungry, and so that's why people, you have to watch it when you start thinking maybe it's ready. But when your starter is, after feeding, is rising and doubling within 2 or 3 hours, then you have a good strong starter. Now there are lots of information out there with people and different opinions on how to know if you have a good strong starter. And I've tried them all, I've listened to them all, and I've baked a lot of things with sourdough starter. And what I have found, and I'm going to get a clean spoon, I want to try to show you what I have found to be a good indicator to me that my starter is healthy and strong. Now, another thing I didn't mention is your starter. When you first begin your new starter, the first few days before it begins to really ferment, it might smell bad, like just not good. It's not a real good smell. But once it begins to ferment, it will smell good. If you've ever smelled any fermented foods, then you will know what I mean by there. When you smell your starter or whatever it is you're fermenting, you will know if that's a good smell or a bad smell. Now, yes, it's sour, so it's going to smell sour, but it's not going to be an off-putting smell. It's not going to be a putrid smell or a smell that makes you gag or anything like that. It's a pleasant smell to me. I think it's pleasant. Like if I smell my starter, it smells good. It does not smell bad. But now that first few days when your starter is just getting started, it's not going to smell really good. It's going to smell kind of weird. But as long as you don't have any mold and you're stirring it every day, you'll be fine. And when it starts to really ferment, that smell will change. And that's when you know, hey, I've got to feed this starter every day. And if you're in a hot environment and your house is really hot, you may have to feed it twice a day. But you will know by the rising and the falling. And really, I wouldn't feed it twice a day when you're trying to get it good and strong. It's not going to hurt it to wait until the next day to feed it, because that's a lot of flour to be wasting, so to speak. But what I want to show you is, so this is my starter. I keep my starter in the refrigerator when I'm not using it. I don't bake sourdough bread every day. I personally love sourdough bread. My family, on the other hand, they like the regular bread that I make, the yeasted bread that I make. They will eat the sourdough, but they prefer the other bread. But I still make sourdough bread from time to time, and I love it. So you can make it and you can freeze it and keep it and use it a long time. So I always keep my starter, but I don't feed it every day. What I do when I get ready to store my starter is I will feed it, and I will feed it and let it sit on the counter until it starts to bubble, but not for a long time, just for a few hours. And then I put my well-fed starter in the refrigerator. Put the lid on it. I put this loose-fitting glass lid on my wet jar, and I put this in the refrigerator. Then when I want to make bread with my starter, I get it out of the refrigerator, usually the night before. Don't do anything to it, just get it out and set it on the counter, and so that it can warm up and wake up. And then the next day, I will feed it the 1:1:1 ratio. I will feed it, and then I am ready to use my starter in my recipe. And then when I'm done baking all the sourdough that I'm going to bake, I feed it on the 1:1:1 ratio, put some in a jar and put it in the refrigerator, and it'll stay there for weeks and weeks. I've really never had any to die on me when I keep it in the refrigerator. Now, if you keep it in there a long time, you will notice that some water will accumulate on top. And actually, I think I have some in the refrigerator. I will get it and show you. Okay, so this is some starter that I've had in the refrigerator for months, really. And as you can see, hopefully you can see this on the top, there's some very dark looking water on the top of this starter, and then the flour, the dough, is like on the bottom. What that's called is hooch. I don't know where that name come from or what it means, but sometimes people will pour that off. But what I recommend doing, and see if I smell that, it smells good. It does not smell bad. But what you want to do when this happens to your starter is you want to stir that all together. Just stir it back in, and then feed your starter with that 1:1:1 ratio. That's all you have to do. Now, if I feed this, it will, since it's been in the refrigerator a long time, it might take it maybe a couple of days to come back to life really strong. Like, it might not wake up, like in the morning, it might still be a little sluggish, but it will wake up and thrive. And that's how I keep my starter. And of course, I knew I was going to be keeping this for a long time, so I put one of these plastic lids and I sealed it down and put it in the refrigerator because I didn't want it to dry out. Personally, I always keep a backup in the refrigerator. So this is my backup, and this is the starter that I use all the time, because I don't want to have to start from scratch if I don't have to. But it's no big deal. If I do, it's just going to take me a couple of weeks, and I might not want to wait that long. Okay, now, so you don't have to feed and discard every day if you get into sourdough baking. You only have to feed when you get ready to bake, and you really won't have any discard because you're going to use some in your baking and then keep some for the next round. But I wanted to show you what I really like, what I can tell my starter is good and strong. And I just got this out of the refrigerator about 30 minutes ago, so it's still really cold. But hopefully you can see, I'm not sure if you can see, but there's bubbles, big bubbles in there. And if I take this spoon and I go down in here, this is, look how stretchy. Can you see that? Can you see that? Look how stretchy. That is a good starter right there. When your starter is stretchy, then you have a good starter. You have a good strong starter. I just love the way it does. Just look at that. So that is how I know that I have a good strong starter. I don't do the float test. People will talk about the float test, where they take a glob of starter and they drop it in water. If it floats, they say that's a good starter. It might be, it might not, because that just means there's air in it, that it has fermented some. But that doesn't mean it's good and strong. See, this starter has broken down the flour and done its job and created that gluten stretch, and it's a good starter. So that's how I know that I have a good starter. And notice the consistency. It's pretty thick. You don't want, now you can use a thin starter, but those make me a little nervous because they're not the 1-to-1-to-1 ratio. If I were going to change that 1-to-1-to-1 ratio at all, it would be less starter. So I would use 1/4 of a cup of flour and 1/4 of a cup of water and 1/8 of a cup of starter. That would work, but it wouldn't work if you had 1/2 a cup of starter, 1/8 a cup of water, 1/8 a cup of flour. Your starter wouldn't have enough food. So anyway, it gets kind of complicated, and there's all kinds of information out there. But once you get a good, healthy starter going, you will be so happy with yourself. You will just love it. Now, I want to go on to the next thing that I was going to talk about. So I always use rye flour to start my flour. Now, this rye flour is brown. And if your family is used to eating white bread and you're trying to break them into sourdough, they're not. Now they've got the sourdough bread, that's new. And then if it's brown, because it will cause your bread to look a little brown, then that's going to be another something they've got to get used to. And you know, people don't like change. So what I usually do is I get my starter thriving using rye flour. And then I start using bread flour. A high gluten bread flour is what I feed my that's what I feed my starter with, is a high gluten bread flour. And I use the 1-to-1-to-1 ratio and feed my starter. And it just works great for me. I haven't had any problems. My starter thrives. It comes back to life just overnight when I bring it out of the refrigerator, and I'm able to use it and make good bread. So after you get it going, then just start feeding it with, and it'll eventually turn white, because you know each time the rye flour is diluted. And it's, so see how this one is pretty brown and this one is white. I started them both the same, and I just started feeding this one with just regular bread flour. Basically, that's all you need to know when it comes to making your starter and maintaining your starter. And then you can use it to make bread anytime. Now, if your starter is not doubling in size, when you feed it. Please be patient and wait until that starter gets good and strong and starts doubling in size. If you don't, and you try to make bread with a starter that is weak, you're going to be very disappointed, because that starter will not make good bread. The bread won't rise well. There's so many things won't work right. So just be patient. I would say patience is the number one thing you need when you're making a sourdough starter. And then the next thing you need is your flour and your water and a container to keep it in. And that's all you need to make your starter. And I hope that you will make one if you want to make sourdough bread. I have a recipe and a video for making sourdough bread in the bread machine. I'll put the link up here so you can watch that. It is super easy. That's the way I make my sourdough. So I hope if you enjoy this video that you will like and subscribe and share. Be sure to watch my other videos. I have lots of bread making videos and other cooking videos and some homesteading videos. I am so glad you joined me, and thanks for stopping by. God bless. Bye-bye.